When they first heard about this thing, it was crew expendable. The next time they sent in Marines, they were expendable too. What makes you think they're gonna care about a bunch of lifers who found God at the ass end of space? You really think they're gonna let you interfere with their plans for this thing? They think we're crud, and they don't give a fuck about one friend of yours that's died. Not one.
I ain't much for begging. Nobody ever gave me nothing. So I say, fuck that thing. Let's fight it.
Fuck it! Let's go for it!
You're listening to Perfect Organism, the Alien Saga podcast. Welcome to Perfect Organism, the Alien Saga podcast. I'm your host, Jaime Prater, and I'm joined by my co-hosts,
Patrick Reed,
Christian
Andie. It's my fault because I did a weird name. I'll make it serious this time. Okay.
Okay.
Also, I'm keeping that in the episode. Patrick Green,
Christian Matska,
and Andie.
Welcome really to the show, everyone.
Hello.
Man, that was good. That was really good.
Here we are, the four of us. This is our first official, formal recorded episode post Alien Day. I know we had the Charlie de la Zarica episode, the commentary that came out last time, and that was really fun. Sorry you missed it, Andie. It was great. Hopefully you can listen to it. But we are in our Alien 3 30th anniversary celebration, and we're here to talk about a character from the film, which will be one of hopefully many conversations about characters in the film. And that character today is Leonard Dillon, played by Charles S. Dutton.
What the fuck is this bullshit that's coming down? I don't want no more bullshit around here.
Leonard Dillon, let it be known, is also a relatively famous musician. So if you Google Leonard Dillon, you're going to get mostly hits for this. He just died in 2011, but a really kind of prolific musician. And then you'll get a couple of hits in there for our boy tonight, who we're talking about, who we're incredibly excited about.
Oh yeah, the murderer.
But before the murderer and rapist of women. But before we get to that, though, I wanted to issue a formal apology to Mr. de la Zarica. I painstakingly tried to make sure that the spelling was correct in her name. In the process of it, my phone capitalized the D, and I was so close. Yeah, it was my phone. I'm sorry about that, Charlie. But that, as you can see from the response to that, that was incredible. And patrons, those of you who are not patrons might be interested to know, patrons got that 4.5 or so days before the rest of you did. So that was pretty cool. And we're going to try to do more of that going forward, of getting stuff out early when we can. So if you're interested in joining Patreon, obviously we'll say this again throughout the show, but it's patreon.com/perfectorganism, I think, or just search for us on Patreon, or go to perfectorganism.com/support. But all that aside, Dillon is a character who is just a throbbing heart in alien fandom. He is, like, for many reasons that we'll get to tonight, a cornerstone of why Alien 3 is so important to me, and I think to a lot of people. But he also says very deep truths, I think, about the human condition in ways that are so eloquent and so beautifully stated. And you know, the character went through so many different changes with the rewrites of the script, and it evolved and it changed. And then Charles S. Dutton got his hands on it, and he just gave us, honestly, one of my favorite performances of any part in any movie I have ever seen. So, Dillon to me is a really special one, and I'm excited to talk about him tonight.
As am I. And we can certainly pass this around, but I wanted to at least mention, we were having some discussions before we started recording. As I approached this episode, I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about this character of Dillon that I really love, and I've loved since I saw the film. But it kind of dawned on me, I loved this character who is a rapist and a murderer. And I thought, okay, I have to think about this, before I kind of throw my support behind him. I guess morally speaking, I mean, kind of, it's a movie, so we can kind of let some things slide. But I thought this would be a great, for me at least, an entryway into some of the things even Dillon talks about in terms of forgiveness and atonement, and they're always kind of in prayer. They're these essentially monks that are living on a prison planet, that are prisoners. And what does that mean? What does their faith, which we don't even really know what their faith is, but what does that mean for them? How does it iterate in them? And have they atoned for their sins, quote unquote? So it should be interesting to talk about further.
Yeah, and to pivot off of what you said about loving the character, but then obviously trying to reconcile that with him being a murderer and rapist. He was definitely one of the standouts from the first time I saw it, and however many times I've seen it since. And there's definitely something to be said for loving the things he says or some of the actions he takes and still taking into account, right, all of that, and just loving the fact that his character, whether we don't love everything about him, like kind of stands out, and he absolutely stands out. So there's a lot to talk about and kind of dissect, and I'm really looking forward to it.
He's also sort of the Paul Reiser of the film for me, because I was a fan of Rock, the TV show that Charles Dutton, in 1991, he started that show. And so it was the same way that I knew Paul Reiser from My Two Dads, to have a preconceived notion of who this person is, and then see a very, very different character. And then to find, of course, and this seems to always come up, that Charles Dutton did serve time, had committed a murder, served his time, and then became an actor. So you can't help but wonder how much of his own personal experience he brought to the role. I love the character as played by Charles S. Dutton. I don't love the character on paper. I think that a lesser actor would not have done as memorable a performance. So for me, it really is the marriage of these lines, good or bad, and this actor to create this amazing performance.
Yeah, I'm glad that, kind of jumping right into it, I'm glad that you're bringing up Charles S. Dutton's past, because he's very open about it. And this is something that, is out there. And it's something that I don't want to dwell on, because sort of like Dillon, I don't want to define him by mistakes that he made in the, earlier in life, but it is also, they're hugely ramified mistakes. It was actually manslaughter he was convicted of. And then he was released from prison and then went back to prison for having a deadly weapon. So he was for possession of a deadly weapon. So he was in and out of the criminal justice system for a long time growing up, and was very much a product of the environment that he grew up in. He dropped out of school when he was a kid because that's just what everybody else had also done. All of his peers had done that. All of the interesting stuff going on was on the street and not in the classroom. And he was sort of like, well, I guess this is my path. And that was really all that he saw, around him. And the rise of Charles S. Dutton from, somebody who was responsible for the death of another human being to this, incredibly beloved actor is a really amazing story. He went to Towson University, went to the Yale School of Drama, got his master's there. He's an inspiration in that way, but the baggage of that early incident and of his early life is something that, you can't analyze the character of Dillon without looking at the actor Charles S. Dutton as well. And it's another one of these cosmic, and I really do mean that, cosmic coincidences that define Alien 3 for me, because it's a movie. I agree with you. On paper, I don't think Dillon is a great character. I think on paper, Alien 3 kind of sucks. We've done a whole series of episodes on not only the script revisions, but the actual, remember we did a whole episode on the actual shooting script and went through the actual thing they filmed with. And, and it was a disaster. It's really doesn't read well. There's continuity issues all over the place. Ripley sounds weird. There's a lot of problems with it. And then somehow through the weird metallurgy that is creating films, things happen like these. And then you look at a character like Dillon and what other actor could have possibly played him other than Charles Dutton? Not only because of his past, which mirrors the characters in kind of a very bizarre way, but also because of the conviction that he brings to it. And I just want to say something before I, move on and pass it over about conviction. To me, that's what Dillon represents, right? Dillon is defined by his conviction, in terms of his religious beliefs, by his beliefs in the people around him, and his beliefs in redemption. and by his beliefs in the coming of the end of the world, right? We're talking about his religious beliefs, right? It's in the movie, it's referred to as a millenarian apocalyptic Christian theology, right? I think that's what they say.
Fundamentalists, yeah.
Yeah. So like to be millenarian, of course, means that you're believing in the coming of the end and the transformation of the world around you into the, promised future, right? So like they are people who are living everything defined by what is to come, and the conviction in that is so deep. But I also mean conviction just from an acting standpoint in the way that he delivers his lines throughout the movie. Charles S. Dutton did this great interview that maybe I'll put in the show notes for people to read because it's really, really good. But he talks about some of his acting inspirations in it. And he says his entire school of acting at, in his whatever 70s now that he's in, like what he's come to believe is that acting boils down to what James Cagney said, which is you look somebody in the eye and you tell them the truth. And he was like, the second I realized that, every other, bit of method acting and, crazy Stanislavski and stuff, like it all kind of went out the window because I realized like all I had to do was be honest. And that's who Dillon is. Dillon is the most honest character, really, I think I would say even in the entire franchise. Like there is nothing dishonest about Dillon, including his past, including the terrible things that he did. He defines himself by those things. He doesn't apologize for them. He carries them as part of the yoke that he wears on him all the time. So Dillon, I just think, is such an ever refreshing character. And I think Charles S. Dutton is really why that is. I agree with you, Christian, on that.
I think it's important to note in terms of who he represents, not just as a character, but even iconically, he's the first African-American character that's in Ripley's life the way Parker was. Of course, we have Apo and we have Frost, we have other characters in Aliens that are present, people of color, men of color, black men, but Dillon is a character that becomes Ripley's right-hand man. And Parker was that for her as well. So I really believe in, Patrick, you and I talked about this before, Dillon really echoes Parker in some fundamental ways, but also being diametrically completely the opposite of who Parker was. They both have their bravado and this kind of gravitas about them, but they're very integral people to Ripley's journey. Without Dillon, Ripley wouldn't have made it out. She just wouldn't have. Even though at one point she wants him to help her make it out. He's like, no, this isn't your time. And no, we got to do other things. If without him doing that, Ripley wouldn't have been able to kind of give the ultimate sacrifice. So I really think his position within her journey is so, so important. She became who she became because of Dillon. He was almost like an apostle. We talked about the Jesus Christ motif, the religious motif of who Ripley represents. And certainly Ripley, in the setting of that prison, became Jesus, and she had her followers. They became her followers. There's this transition where they started to believe, like, okay, we don't know what we're doing, but she does. What should we do? And then you had obviously your Judas, who was, not Morse, but the guy who lets him out. What's his name? Golic, yeah. But I really, Dillon really became Ripley's Paul, and was there to ensure her survival, not just for her, but for himself and everyone else, as much as he could, as long as he could. And as I think about that, the more I think about that, the more profound it becomes.
I've said in past episodes, I feel like there's always a character who is presented as almost an obstacle to Ripley. You have Parker, you have Hudson, and you have Dillon, of someone who up front gets in her face, doesn't believe her, and she has to shut them down or prove them wrong and win them over. And for the third iteration of this, Dillon is absolutely fascinating. He's maybe even my categorization isn't correct, but using that, it's not stale, it's not tired. Dillon is fascinating. And I like your idea of the conviction. He didn't have to tell her why he was there. And we can question even, is it brutal honesty, or is he actually scared of her and trying to scare her away? I'm sure we're going to talk about the breakfast scene, or whatever you want to call it. I was actually rereading the Alan Dean Foster version of it, and there's a really funny, in his version, it says, "I'm a murderer and rapist, period, of women," as a separate sentence, which is definitely not how the line is delivered. But
he also in the novelization has a single dreadlock, I believe.
Really?
Which is interesting, yeah. And I think a symbol of his penance, because I think he knows the lice are going to attack him, and he keeps a single dreadlock. That's one thing I remember. That's the novelization. I know people shit on it all the time. Is like my favorite of all of the novelizations, because it's so different and so bonkers and so out there. Anyway, Christian, go ahead.
He also in the novel, and again, this isn't coming from anything except Alan Dean Foster having some fun and getting paid by the word, but they go into, well, I didn't think that women were allowed. He said, oh, there just aren't any women sent here. There's plenty of women who are incarcerated. We just don't have any. And so that, in an interesting way, takes away the possible interpretation of sexism in that scene. When he calls her intolerable in the movie, we have to question, wait, why is she intolerable? Is she intolerable simply because she's a woman? And the novel goes a different direction. So it's just an interesting read for that.
Yeah, to go back to the conviction, right? That strength of his perceived moral conviction, right? Or his perception of where he's come from and how far he's, like, his journey. He definitely recognizes that in Ripley, right? And again, just like in the other two movies, there's always somebody who recognizes that strength, and whatever his initial sort of thoughts of her is, he turns that corner because he sees part of himself in Ripley. And I think more so than any other character here. I mean, obviously you have Clemens bonding with her too, but I think Dillon matches her strength for strength in this more than anyone else.
No one else in the film series stands up and says, all right, let's go do this. You have we're all strung out, stay frosty. Oh, Patrick disagrees with me.
I would argue that Parker says that, right? Because it's his idea to pursue the alien in the first place once you get the incinerator units.
It's not really his idea. He wants to kind of go haphazard, but Ripley's trying to be given order to it. Like, first we do this and then we do this. And he's talking over her. It's like, will you listen to me? Shut up. So he's kind of all over the place, and she's trying to quiet him down. Okay. Whereas with Dillon's more like, no, this is what we have to do. Dillon's kind of ordering Ripley in a way.
Yeah, good point. Okay. Stand corrected.
Parker's, his energy is so chaotic in that moment. I mean, which is just beautiful acting. And completely fits the tone of that movie. It would be very strange if any of the members of the Nostromo crew gave a speech like Dillon does. It would be very strange if any of the Colonial Marines gave a speech like Dillon as well. So it's kind of funny for a movie that everyone slags on for being so nihilistic and apocalyptic. It's the only place that you can have someone legitimately and with sincerity give that kind of, I'm not gonna die on my knees kind of speech.
Oh, fuck!
You're all gonna die. The only question is how you check out. Do you want it on your feet? Or on your fucking knees? Begging. I ain't much for begging. Nobody ever gave me nothing. So I say, fuck that thing. Let's fight it.
Fuck it! Let's go for it!
He's had, pretty much a lifetime of thinking about that. Whereas the first two movies, they're just thrust into this survival mode. And here he is, having spent years coming to terms with that. So you're right. There's that moment where it feels authentic. Like you were saying, there's a truth behind that. And in any other movie, it would have been Like, where's this coming from? Right? They just want to get out of there. In this case, he's there. He's been there for however long. How long has he been there? Did he say exactly?
I know he was born in 2138 and it's 2179 in the events of the film. So that's his lifespan at that point, but I don't know how long he's been in prison for, but you know, I would presume decades.
Right.
The trading card is whoever wrote the trading card clearly wasn't very comfortable with the source material. So he is listed as having committed 2 counts of rape and murder, the least amount practically that they could give him. It's like, okay, this still, you know, he said plural women, so we got to go with 2. It's kind of fun. I've been doing some research, like S.D. Perry in her Weyland-Yutani report. She gives a backstory to the religion, that it actually is larger than just this one penal colony, that it spans the whole Weyland-Yutani prison system. And it's called the Brotherhood. That's what they belong to. And she gives an excerpt of a sermon that he had given that is not in the film. It's her own writing, and it's really good. It gives a much better idea of, you know, very much an angry God concept of how they see themselves and how they see their creator. But again, other prisoners get much more elaborate backstories for the crimes they committed and how long they've been in there. So I feel like because he does tip over into the heroic or the protagonist role, they're like, let's just downplay as much as possible what he's in here for.
But what's so funny is I would think if there was any character who would not want to downplay it, it would be Dillon, right? Like to me, again, going back to the conviction, and I mean, we're saying conviction, he's also a convict, so it kind of makes sense. Like to me, like that is part of how he defines himself. You know, when we were reading the Sarah Welch Larson book, and we had her on, which again is great. If people missed that on Alien, we did a lot on Alien Day, so that was one of the episodes. Go back and make sure you listen to it. It was like 2 episodes before this one. You know, she had a lot to say about the prisoners and about the way that they use religion. And, you know, of course she has a somewhat theological background, like a theological philosophical background. So she had some really cool illuminating things to say about it. And one of the main themes that she was hitting on was this idea that the prisoners in Alien 3 have depersonalized themselves so much willingly that they have essentially defined themselves by negating themselves as individuals. And so, you know, I think an interesting way to look at Dillon is through the lens of that, because he's so much more than an individual, right? Like the themes and the ideas that he talks about are so huge and so collectivist, and they feel like, you know, like they belong. He's such a humanist, it feels like, but he's also defining himself by getting rid of his humanity, by getting rid of the things that distinguish him, the things that make him who he is. So I guess I'm saying that because I'm thinking about the moments, you know, like if we look at Dillon through the things that he says, and I think, like we've been saying, I think if there is a character you can really judge by what they're saying, I think it is Leonard Dillon. You know, think about what he believes in. He believes, and he says this over and over again, including in the, you know, my favorite part of any Alien film outside of the derelict sequence, which, you know I get shit on because it's emotional, but the burial scene, the leadworks, like his speech there, which has of course become very famous, similar to some of Charles S. Dutton's scenes in Rudy, you know, they're kind of part of pop culture. His scenes in there, you know, say for example, we commit these bodies to the void with a glad heart, right? Because within the promise of every seed, there is a flower, and every life, no matter how small. And he has this very deeply rooted belief that death is the beginning of the next stage. In an earlier version of the script, so in the sequence when he's talking about not wanting to die on their knees and going out and fighting, he ends that by saying, this is your first step towards heaven, right? So he also defines, he's aware of their corporeal surroundings. He's aware of the life that they're living right now. And he's also aware that it's basically a crucible, according to his millenarian beliefs, for the birthing of the pearl that is the next stage of their existence.
Why are the innocent punished? Why the sacrifice? Why the pain? There aren't any promises. Nothing's certain. only that some get called, some get saved. She won't ever know the hardship and grief for those of us left behind. We commit these bodies to the void with a glad heart. For within each seed, there is a promise of a flower. And within each death, no matter how small, there's always a new life. A new beginning. Amen.
I have, some friends who are in recovery from substance abuse, disorders, for example. And a lot of them use language like that. This language of, I am not ashamed of what I've done because there's nothing to be gained from being ashamed of it. I'm focusing on the future, and I'm focusing on building, and I'm focusing on what's to come. But with Dutton, with Dutton, with Dillon, even his name is the same fucking thing. It's like, how perfect is he for this part? With Dillon, he expands that really to this idea of what's to come, not just what's to come after his quote unquote recovery or after his sentence. He stays because what is to come is so much greater to him than that. And then, of course, speaking of what differentiates him from other characters, he's the only character we ever get. Christian's going to have an exception to this, I guarantee, because you're a very close watcher. But I think, as I'm ass talking right here, that Dillon is the only character that goes in hand-to-hand combat on screen with an alien. Is that true? Does anybody else actually punch an alien in the face? No, right?
Well, you never see him punch him. He just says, fuck you. And he takes
He's punching him.
But you don't ever see him throw a
he's
punch.
got a fucking left hook in there. Yes, he is.
No.
Well, he's close quarters combat.
To actually physically, Parker gets hit in the face with a tail. No. I think Dillon is the only one, for what it's worth, didn't help him, but I think he's the one.
He did, right? But although you're right, Parker is the only other one who engages one sort of hand to hand, and it doesn't last very long. It's basically instant, but he does actually confront the alien physically. But Dillon, it's just, what a great personification of this idea of, do you want to go out on your knees or go out fighting? Like that. It's again, one of these amazing sequences that the character gets in the movie that says everything you need to know. And he dies willingly and joyfully. That's the other thing too, right? We're so used to, by this point in these movies. I've like every single death that has come before this has been one of fear, right? Again, I'm making a categorical statement, so call me out if I'm wrong. But I can't think of another character who willingly dies joyfully. Like, he dies with a smile on his face, that is an amazing, it's an overhead shot. He's smiling. He's fucking smiling. He's punching, he's smiling.
I don't want no more bullshit around here.
He's joyful.
Well, I would challenge you on I think that moment where he takes his glasses off, you see fear, you see resolution, you see confrontation. He's terrified, but this is the right thing, and I gotta do it. That's what I don't see joy. I see resolve. Like, this is what I'm here for. This is what God put me here for, to fight this thing, to let that woman live. This is what I'm here for. And he's ready, but you can see fear in his eyes for a minute, and then it just turns into resolve. And then it turns to bring it on. What are you going to do? Just kill me? If that's all you're going to do, I can handle that.
Yeah, I agree. There's a liminal moment there where he's afraid. But to me, what's so fascinating is how quickly that goes away and turns into something that doesn't feel like machismo. It doesn't feel like he's trying to show off for anybody. It feels like, it feels to me almost ecstatic. It feels like religious ecstasy almost. It's like, this is the end of his life, and he knows it, and he's going to go so joyfully into that moment. Again, and I use joy in a non-ironic way. There's a joy in Dillon's religious convictions. There's a joy in his belief in what's to come that is like very dark, and it's surrounded by darkness. But I don't know. I see a lot of joy in that. You're fucking giving me shit.
I wouldn't use the term joy.
Nobody ever gave me nothing, Jamie.
What the fuck?
I say fuck.
I wouldn't use the term joy, but I would use the term he is resolved. This is a man resolved in his faith. He's resolved in where he is in terms of being on the prison planet. He's a leader among the men, next, essentially down from Aaron. He is the next in line, as much as a convict can be. Clemens was a convict. He's not a convict anymore. He's just kind of there. But yeah, I mean, I think what you're getting at, I do agree with. I think there is something about Dillon and his countenance that's very much, I'm at peace. And you rarely see someone at peace in an Alien film. And even when things are happening and, people are being killed, he's just rolling with it. He's not freaking out. He's like, you know what? This is what God has for me. He doesn't usually use those terms, but you can see it. This is a man of faith. And typically people who are religious tend to perceive everything through that lens. Anything they go through, they're going to perceive through the lens of, this is what religion has for me. This is what God has for me. This is my trial. This is my triumph. I'm here for God. And it's almost a peace they have, you know, about that. And it is no more found in the character of Dillon. But I wanted to take us back to that breakfast scene, because I think it's a really powerful scene. And I think it's the first time Ripley underestimates her surroundings, because up until then, Ripley's she's calling the shots. She knows what she's doing. She knows where she is. The Marines are kind of like all over. They got their, their bravado and their whatever. And she's kind of like, whatever, you guys can do that, but I know how serious this is. But when she comes into the mess hall for breakfast or whatever time of day they're eating, it's a similar setup in Aliens, where there's everyone in a mess hall, but she's not commanding attention. She's entered into the viper pit, into the lion's den. She has entered into a place where she is a threat, not because she is a woman, not because people hate women, but because most of the men there, or I don't know about most, seems to be a larger percentage of the men there are convicted of crimes against women. So, and then there's this reading that you see in her face and Dillon's face. Dillon's kind of like, you can almost see it in his eyes where he's like, God, what are you doing to me? Why would you do this to me? We've had a good place to wait here. Those words he does say. And she takes a seat and she's kind of in some ways challenging them, mocking them a little bit. The way, and a way Ripley has never done before. I've never seen her act like this before. But there's these visual cues in Dillon's eyes where he's looking at her like, and he's like, yeah, I'm a murderer and I'm a rapist of women. And she's like, well, I guess I must make you nervous. And in that moment, I remember thinking, Ripley, you don't know what you're fucking doing. This isn't like, these aren't Marines that you need to like, corral and take the lead of. These people will fucking kill you. And you are their enemy. And they have been in a place where they have had rest and peace. Maybe not rest. I don't know what goes on in them, but as much rest as they can have, as much peace as they can find. And you can see the disappointment in Dillon's face of that she is present and that like, what is this going to mean for us? What is this going to mean for our camaraderie, for our unity now that she is here? And that whole scene, maybe we can even do an anatomy of a scene sometime, is really fascinating because there's a power struggle and Ripley does not have the upper hand.
So from my perspective, as a woman who, has never been in that situation, but think of where she is, no weapons, right? She's vulnerable physically, obviously, in that regard. And the one weapon she has in that situation to counter that is this perceived strength, this confidence, because she knows, vulnerability to these men is like, that's the jumping off point. Like they see a vulnerable victim that, that's what they're going to attack. It's more about power, right? So that's the only thing she's armed with. Plus, she just doesn't give a fuck. Right? She's lost everything. So she's like, at this point, kind of bring it. But I think I don't think she's underestimating them. I think she's just, there's nothing else I can bring literally to this table except my confidence, because that maybe will ward them off, right? Maybe that'll throw them off enough where I'm not this vulnerable. That's my take on it.
A couple of things. First of all, she pours a glass of orange juice, so it's absolutely breakfast. I believe that this is day 3. I think she crashes. She wakes up the next day. We have the autopsy. We have the funeral. 3rd day, she pours orange juice, so we know that it's breakfast. I think that she is honestly there to thank Dillon for the words that he said. I don't think she's lying about that. But it's such a trope in movies. If you're going into prison, you have to find the toughest person and you have to beat him up so that you have standing in the jail. And she can't beat him up physically. So I think that she honestly is looking to have a verbal confrontation and prove her prowess. And she does. And then, as Andie said, she has no fucks left to give. She just, she's so brutally honest about not having any faith and kind of poking at him for what he's saying.
Let me pose this question then. Do you think she should have joined them in that mess hall? I've always felt like, what are you doing? This is not the place. This is not like, and maybe to your point, Andie, she was like, well, either I stand my ground and I make myself known to them, but at the same time, like, there are, how many men are there? 15, 20 men, however many there are.
25.
25 convicts.
According to Andrews.
Who, if they want to, can do horrible things to you. So my first reaction was like, what are you doing? Why are you going in this room? Eat your breakfast alone. But maybe if she's probably, she's between a rock and a hard place. If she stays on her own, she then becomes this mystery. Well, where is this woman? Where is she? But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, maybe they can wonder that, but she's still safer if they don't know where she is, as opposed to her presenting herself, into the mess hall. But I think that's me responding to my fear for her. My fear, like, what are they going to do to you? Please be smarter than this. And she didn't seem like she was.
Well, part of that is the script. They repeatedly, Andrews keeps saying, keep her confined. You're quarantined. And then the next thing, we see her bopping off somewhere else. And the script needs her to do that because she has to investigate. She has to make these connections. But I wish that there had been a better way to get her to interact with people instead of repeating that exact pattern of Andrews says, you're confined to the infirmary. Cut to the next scene. Here's Ripley off on her own. Because it wears thin after a little bit. Like, what is even going on with this? But I do feel like her deciding to go and thank Dillon for the words that he said is enough justification to get us there. And also, this does parallel Ripley on the Sulaco saying, I feel like a third wheel. Is there anything I can do? She wants to show off that there's something that she can do. And in that case, it's, I can drive a power loader. It's not a perfect comparison, but at least there's been an example in Ripley's life that we've seen of her finding herself in an awkward situation and looking to prove herself by performing a function or doing something. And in the cafeteria, it has to be, she's witty. She has the ability to beat people in an argument or in a conversation, because there's not much else that she can do there.
I think it's very analogous to the I can drive a power loader moment in Aliens, because I think part of what's important about the function of that moment is it's a continual negation of who Ripley is as we see her, right? And like her being insubordinate, quote unquote, although there's no chain of command, but her like always doing what Andrews is saying not to do, is very much in keeping with the Ripley that we know and love, right? It's like Ripley, like ever since she first broke protocol, has not given a fuck about it ever since. She's been primarily concerned with preserving life and staying alive, right? And so we see her doing that. Like we see her not being told what to do by a bunch of assholes and going off and doing what she wants to do. And then what is important though is that in that moment she hits a wall, and that wall is Dillon, right? That wall and so are we. And that again, there's this wonderful interplay between the audience and the script in Alien 3. Right. We've talked about this many times, even just the last few episodes and the last 6 hours of commentary tracks that we've done. There's a really vital journey that we go on that mirrors Ripley's journey, in that we start the movie with this nuclear family that we're so in love with being torn apart. We feel actual loss as an audience, not just as an empathetic audience, but as an audience ourselves, because we lost those characters, which is really fucking terrible. And then we go through this whole thing, and then we lose our ultimate hero at the end of it. And it's a real sense of a void. It's a really important loss to feel. Likewise, as an audience, we are so inspired by Dillon's speech, and we are so emotionally grateful to him because he has helped put a balm on the loss that we suffered as an audience. And again, I'm reinforcing, we're not suffering this empathetically. We're suffering it as actual people because we lost those characters. And Dillon made us feel better, and he made us cry, and he made us release. So we want to thank him for that too. And then just like Ripley, we are rebuffed. And we are brought to this cold reality that the world doesn't function the way that we keep wanting it to. And this movie doesn't function the way we keep thinking movies should. This movie doesn't give us that emotional payoff where they become best friends. Like, this movie presents, actual hostility back at her, which is so shocking and so appropriate, I think, for us as an audience, because then we have to go, okay, this is not the movie. This movie isn't done with us yet, you know? One of my favorite, there's no way that I haven't brought this up before in the context of Alien 3, but I haven't probably since the first time I did a series on it. So my favorite author is David Foster Wallace, and my favorite quote by him is a quote that says, "The truth shall set you free, but not until it is finished with you." And to me, that drives home the point of Alien and why it's so powerful. And Dillon is that truth who is saying, like, you don't have a payoff yet. You know, we have a journey to go on, and you're going to get there, but it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be what you expect. And so, yeah, again, like, he's rebuffing the audience as much as he's rebuffing Ripley. And it's part of the journey that we have with her in this movie that I think is so fucking important, because after that, like, what is there left of the Ripley we know? I mean, it's also the first time, it's the first time we see her with a shaved head, outside of when she's actually doing it. Right. It's the first time we see her with the prison garb on. So she doesn't even look like herself anymore. And she is now not able to function as herself either. And it's a real negation that, again, I think is really important for this character's journey.
We're going to take a break and be right back. We all remember that moment. The first time we heard a theme from our favorite movie. How it stayed with us, comforted us, stirring our imagination. Sublime Noise is our Patreon-exclusive film score review show. Starting at just $4 a month, you will gain access to Sublime Noise as well as our warehouse of frame rate episodes where we discuss and review our favorite films. To sign up, go to www.perfectorganism.com/support.
Can I ask you guys what you think he means when he says we can tolerate anyone, even the intolerable? What does he mean by intolerable?
He means that she is the embodiment, in my opinion, certainly from my religious background, which I know you have one as well, Christian. Like, I feel like she is representing actual lust, actual sin, actual, the difference between them staying the path and leaving the path for maybe raping someone else, maybe killing someone else, maybe doing terrible things. They've been on this balance beam, and so far they've had rails on this balance beam, but all of a sudden the rails have been taken off and she's there. And I think she's intolerable because, don't you honestly think she is intolerable? Not as who she is as a character, but if you put a woman say you put a woman in Rikers, in an all-male area in Rikers, that's an intolerable thing. That woman will be probably eventually dead. Ripley represents something that they cannot control. They so much can't control it that they've been in prison for it. So when you go to prison for rape and murder, there's something wrong with because we all have switches. Like, we get angry, we've all been angry, but we're not going to hit anyone, we're not going to kill anyone, right? Because we don't do that. These people don't have that mechanism. They've gone so far as to let their lust or whatever's going on in their heads, rape people and then kill them. Or, vice versa, whatever happens. So Ripley to me represents all of what they've done to people before. So when Ripley's looking at Dillon, Dillon's not just seeing Ripley, Dillon's seeing the other women he's killed and the other women he's raped. That's what's intolerable. It's like, for me, like, I don't even know it's like, I mean, I had a cousin die from gang violence when I was 17, or he was 17 and I was 15. And it's like, if someone put me in a room with his killer, that would be intolerable for me. I wouldn't, that's something that I just could not do. And they were forced to do it. And so then, of course, when you get to the rape scene, I was kind of like, well, duh. And then not just because there's a woman there, but she's also acting like she can do Ripley, like you said, to your point, Patrick. She's acting like the Ripley we always know, where she's going to go and do her own thing, but she's not reading the room. She is not safe there. She's the alien there right now. She is the threat to them before it all transitions and they realize the actual creature is the threat. So that is my long answer to you.
Yeah, I view the intolerable as what they view as intolerable about themselves. Right? And it's the classic religious story. Oh, the woman made us do it. They made us do it. Right? So that's how I interpreted it. It's just what I find intolerable in myself. She is the manifestation of that.
Yeah, completely. And I'm glad you're bringing this up, Christian, because that's a line that I always kind of wrestle with when he says it. Because I'm always like, what is he really getting at? But I think you're both, interpreting it the way that I usually end up interpreting it. It's worth noting that in addition to being violent offenders, they're also double Y chromosome violent offenders, which I want to say that is an actual thing. Some males are born XYY with an extra Y chromosome.
I just taught this today.
Did you really?
I did.
All right, tell us about it.
Yeah, I was teaching genetics today. I was talking about, it's basically a function of meiosis and how certain chromosomes they fail to separate. It's called non-disjunction. So some eggs, in the case of the double Y, like sperm can wind up with 2 versus 1, and then that's fertilized, and then you get that extra copy. In the case of the double Y, sometimes that initial sperm fertilization, like it for whatever reason, there's like a double copy. It could be a mutation. But the Y, the thing that represents that maleness, and we tend to think of like testosterone and all of that, that's the that double Y as we talked about. But you can have conditions where it's double X, triple X, or just one X and then nothing. So there's all, kinds of crazy combinations.
It's not like if you have this, it doesn't mean you're like a murderer.
Right.
I want to be clear with people that we're not trying to say that.
The movie is though.
The movie is,
does.
And rightfully so. Like it's okay. Like, it's a movie, but I guess the reason why I'm bringing that particular part up is like within the universe of Alien 3 and the Alien saga, like we are being told that not only are these violent offenders, but they're genetically predisposed to violence according to the rules of this film. Right. So their destiny is to be violent. And what they've done through this, religious order and through serving their sentences and then staying on is they've transcended that for themselves, right? Like there are no weapons there. There's no violence being committed. We see people being very orderly. We see people coming to communal decisions on things. It's a really, like, for all of the shittiness of it, it's a nice place to be because, like, you're seen and understood as who you actually really are, as opposed to any kind of artifice of anything else, right? You get a real sense of like, there's an honesty to their existence. And so Ripley's destabilizing to that. And that is like hugely traumatic for them. And I totally agree with what both of you were saying about that. But yeah, it's an interesting line.
I wanted to mention another really powerful scene that I feel like is overlooked, and for the sake of some context, in every film, the two prior, in Alien, when Ripley is in the mother room and she's finding out information and she's distraught and she starts breaking down, and then all of a sudden Ash shows up there. She grabs Ash by the collar and kind of roughs him up, and he's shocked by it. And she's taller than him. She's powerful. She's a big woman, not obviously in this large, like overweight, but she's got a domineering force, and she roughs him up. And then of course in Aliens, you see her do that with Burke. She just takes control, and and it's shocking. You can tell in the moment it's shocking to these men, And even in Alien 3, the assembly cut, she does that with, actually, even, I think the theatrical a little bit, she does that with 85. She pulls him up by the collar and he kind of breaks out, but he's also kind of shocked by it. And then she tries it with Dillon. And Dillon just like throws her right up against the wall. And it's the first time that's ever happened to Ripley. It's the first time Ripley is, for lack of better words, put in her place. And I don't mean her place like this is the place that you belong, but in terms of the hierarchy of how things happen in this prison, she is not in control. Even this is post them turning to her and he's like, sister, do some leadership. Like they're asking her, what do we do? They're coming to her. Everyone's looking up to her, as the savior to help them get out of this place. Even within that context, Dillon isn't having it with her. Dillon's not going to let her. I mean, I don't think she'd be able to pick him up, but she grabs him by the collar and it's like, look, like she's always done. And again, he throws her against the wall and she slides down and he kind of tells her off. And I thought it was a really interesting moment for her character. And then you see her kind of shriveled up in the corner, defeated. And it's the first time I've really seen Ripley defeated. Now we've seen her distressed. We've seen her cry. We've seen her, in moments where she's vulnerable or when Newt is taken or when she finds, she realizes she's alone on the ship in Alien. But this is the first time in my memory, if you guys can correct me for sure, where I feel like someone else has put Ripley in her place, has said, no, you don't have power here. I do. And, it's a really interesting dynamic. And it's a fairly long scene as well. And even later on, she's like, you need to kill me. And you can see this moment in his face like, man, I don't want to do this. I've already killed women before. This is why I'm here. This is why I'm here, is because I've killed women. And I'm going to kill another woman. And I'm going to cut her head off or whatever he's going to do to her. And then he takes his own agency like, no, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this for you. And it's really powerful. And again, I feel like we haven't really discussed these power dynamics between Ripley and Dillon. She's not shared any power dynamics like this with any other character in any other film.
Well, it's important to note, he does say that he'll kill her, but he says it dies first, then you, right? So he is going to do it, but he has the alien has to go first, right?
Or is he going to do it? Because at the very end, he makes her get out of whatever that confined space is. It was the perfect place for her to stay and die. And he's like, no, climb out. Your God will take care of you, sister. I wonder if maybe he really is never, ever going to do this again. So talking about conviction, he may say to her, because he's the one that figures out, we can use this. If it won't kill you, then we can use this. And the only way that he can make her go along with that is to placate her by saying, and then of course I'll kill you, wink. But I've never thought about this before, but I'm wondering, there's no chance in hell that he's going to kill her because he's done with that. That's not who he is anymore.
I agree.
That's crazy. I've never thought of that before.
Do you think he doesn't kill her for her sake or his own sake? Because it's all about his redemption, right? And like you were saying, he's convinced, he has conviction that he's going to this better place, right? He's done the work, he's repented. And part of me thinks it's not so much for her sake, it's I'm not doing this again because I know where I'm going after this and I'm going to get there. Like, I think he's just singularly driven in that regard. And it's like, you're not, like, she's intolerable because you're not going to make me do that again and fall back and lose my standing with God that I have worked all these decades to get to. I feel like it's more of a selfish motivation. It's not so much about Ripley as it is. He's not going there again.
The only way I'd push back on that, I think that's very valid. I don't know that he believes that he is in any way redeemed or exonerated. I think he truly believes, because of what he's done, he's on the outs with God. He just knows that maybe having only two murders on his record is still better. I don't know. It's really interesting. As you guys know, I really struggle with that final scene I feel like Ripley climbs out because the script needs her to, not because it makes sense for that moment. And this is actually giving at least a little bit of reasoning for why Dillon is telling her to climb out. So I'm excited about that.
Or I'll push back on you a little bit. I think in that moment when there's this beast that's terrifying, I think everything is adrenaline, and you're just, let's get away. Let's get away. Oh, look, we can get away. You can crawl up this thing. And I think that's what you do. You're not even thinking. And then all of a sudden it was this moment where, oh, we're going to crawl out. And then Ripley's like, oh, but wait, you're supposed to do this for me. You're supposed to do this thing. And by that time she kind of recalls that she's already at the top. So, but I mean, certainly it could be, to your point, Christian, that's what the script needed her to do. But I also feel like in a time like that where you're faced with what Patrick has perfectly said before, the face of oblivion, which is the creature, something's happening in your body where it's fight or flight, you know? And it was flight for both of them until it clicked in with Dillon that I got to stay here with this thing. Now, there's some weird things with that whole scene. Like, why wouldn't the creature just crawl right out then too? Like, why would it stay down there with Dillon? But who knows? Maybe he thought Dillon was a threat to Ripley, so him keeping Dillon down there keeps Ripley safe. Probably that's the reasoning. That makes the most sense. But it's an interesting question to understand why they crawled out, or if it was in service of the script, or if it was in service of fear, or, hey, we can get out. I mean, I don't think Dillon wanted to die. I think he realized he had to die.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on you too. I think if we all push back on each other, eventually we just form a circle that's just pushing back in itself.
I don't want no more bullshit around here.
No, I do think that Dillon stays there to distract the alien long enough for Ripley to do something about it. To me, she's going out to turn. I mean, she's going out to turn on the lead works. She's going out to keep the plan in motion, right? Isn't she? Isn't that what she's doing? So
Morse is the one. Morse is waiting for the signal. Maybe
he's
she
up
gives
there
the
already.
signal.
Right. But she has to get the signal to him, you know. I think she's, I mean, maybe she's going there to advance the script, but I think she's going there to advance the death of this thing. And then to make sure that then, because the thing is that, all right, so here, if I'm Ripley in this moment, which I like to think of myself as, you know, I'm a kind of a Ripley person, you know.
What the fuck is this bullshit that's coming down?
I wish. But if I were, what I would be thinking is I'm not going to allow myself to be killed until I can guarantee that this thing is dead. If she stays down in the lead works with Dillon and the creature, she does not have that guarantee because it could get out after she died, right? And indeed, it actually does. Like, it jumps out of the lead, right? So it's only after the sprinkler turns on that it actually dies. So I think that to me, that's kind of what's driving her in that moment.
I'll just push back that she was asking Dillon to kill her before the alien had been recaptured or captured the first time. I can't remember now. The recaptured in the special edition anyway. So there was a moment at least where she was more concerned about killing what was inside her than in dealing with the very real threat that was out there. But that's a good pushback.
That's true.
I wish I could push back again on that, but I can't. That's a good one.
A really beautiful thing in the relationship between Dillon and Ripley, and I'm sure obviously all of you have noticed this, is he's concerned about her well-being. There's a couple of times he's like, how are you? Are you okay? Clearly there's things going on with Ripley at that moment where she doesn't know she has an alien inside her, when she's coughing and she's, you know, she can feel something's wrong with her, or she's just out of it. She's probably just attributing to cryo sickness and being shaken out of cryo too early. But Dillon is really, and then, you know, he asks her, he's like, I bet you're missing Doc. And she's like, why would you say that, or whatever she says? And he's like, that's what I thought. He's like, well, you've been looking through some peepholes, but there's concern for him. I really feel like Dillon of the convicts has atoned for his sins, I see that, like, I feel it from him that he rescued Ripley from a rape that he could have taken part in. Honestly, this man has atoned for his, I don't want to ever use the term mistakes when it comes to rape and murder. Those are horrible, awful, awful, awful things that aren't mistakes. They're intentional. But I really feel like you can see it in his eyes that this man is sorry for what he's done. And Ripley is Ripley becomes two things. Whereas we're talking about her being intolerable in the mess hall, where then she becomes tolerable. She becomes his atonement. Ripley becomes Dillon's atonement for this film. Her safety, her well-being, protecting her essentially at every turn, as much as, the script allowed it. Shutting up Morse, putting people in their place, letting her speak. Now, there is the dynamic that we talked about in terms of who has the power between the two of them, and it's clearly Dillon, but he cares about Ripley in the way that Parker cared about Ripley, in the way that Hicks cared about Ripley. But it's also this, he's a little bit afraid of himself, and you can see it, that this man's afraid of himself. He's afraid of himself in front of her. But he knows what doing the right thing is. And so I'm saying all this to also say, we hear criticism about Alien 3, like, oh, it's just a bunch of people running around. We don't get to know anyone. If you're paying attention, there's really intense and in-depth character studies going on in this movie. Certainly with Dillon, I know we're going to talk about Clemens. We're certainly going to talk about Ripley again, but Dillon is highly complex. But to an earlier point that you made, Patrick, so much of that complexity is within the performance of Charles S. Dutton. His eyes when he looks at her, where you're kind of like, he's seeing her as a person. He's not seeing her as an object. He's not seeing her as a sex object or this thing in his way of something else that he wants. And it is a kind of a transformation of this character before our eyes, if we're paying attention.
I feel like there are two moments with Dillon where we see through his words and his actions how he feels about himself. When Boggs and Rains tell him in the extended cut that they don't want to work with Golic, and they lay it out, they tell him, he smells bad and he's crazy. And those probably are very true things, but Dillon tells them that they have to because he's a brother and this is what we're going to do. And I feel like accepting Golic, the most damaged member of this brotherhood, is Dillon almost saying to them, no, I'm just as bad as this guy. We're all equals in this. You've got to take him with you. We're not going to exclude anybody. And then when he brings the lead pipe to break up the attempted rape, of course her presence was upsetting to him and probably was a temptation to him, but it's not okay. And I feel like when he told her that we accept even the intolerable, and then for that to happen, it's almost like he takes it personally because they're breaking with his rules and he wants this harmony. He's the focus of it all. And so I think he's particularly brutal in that moment because he's punishing them for his own weakness.
Yeah, because if one of them starts to unravel and that system that they built, like she kind of throws a wrench literally right into the system, and then there's vulnerability for him to unravel, right? So he's got to keep their, all of that they worked for to kind of contain and keep it contained. I do think he's legitimately trying to help her, right, in that moment. But there's also that we can't have this because it's all just going to fall apart. And then we're just going to descend back into what we were, right? Because he's, again, put in the work. They've all put in that work and they've got to keep that. It's like having, being, clean and sober for years and then having that drink just constantly waved in front of you.
Yeah, and just one more thing about Golic, who I think deserves a full episode now that we're kind of talking. I think that's another character we should really devote some time to because he's such an interesting window, not only into the themes in the movie, but into the way it was made. But, he also sticks up for Golic again when Andrews accuses Golic of murdering the prisoners, right? And he says he's crazy, he's a fool, but he's not a liar, right? He says, you don't know that he's never lied to me. That, I think, says a lot about him too, because when his back is against the wall, he will not let any of the brothers take the blame for anything, right? And he is more willing to accept the impossible than he is to allow one of his brothers to take the fall for something. I guess, as we kind of come around to closing this conversation, which, I'm not saying we have to wrap right now, but just sort of as we kind of get our thoughts together, I think Dillon does something really amazing that so few films do. And Alien 3 does this over and over again. And that he presents us with a character who is so clearly protagonistic by the end of the movie. Like, he's so clearly a heroic. He has the end of Braveheart for his fucking death scene, like he is a protagonist by any stretch of that definition. And yet he is very upfront that he is committed atrocities, right? I mean, he hasn't just larcenied a fucking car. Like, he has murdered and raped women. And we have to hold those two things in our heads the entire movie. We have to hold in our heads how we feel about redemption as people, as moviegoers, what we are willing to accept. Like, he is the grayest of gray characters. There is absolutely, for a guy who's so defined by his convictions, by his sort of black and whiteness, like, morally speaking, there is nothing black and nothing white about that character. And in fact, the black and the white exist because of each other. They are intertwined with each other. His religious conviction and his incredible inspirationalism and his humanity and his love and his brotherhood and what he is able to bring out in people, which is great. I mean, he's able to make all of these ragtag convicts into like this well-oiled machine that looks out for itself, that protects itself. Like, he's able to do these amazing things. And also, he is also a murderer and rapist of women. And we have to hold those two things in our heads at the same time throughout the movie, so that even by the time he has his big heroic death sequence, we are still forced to, as Jaime opened the show with, reckon with the fact that we know that this guy probably fucking deserved it because of what he did. Or did he? That's the question. And that's what's beautiful about Alien 3 is the whole thing is gray like that. The whole thing is so hard. It's so inscrutable. And that, I think, is part of why it's so ever presently beautiful to talk about,
I think part of how we can find him palatable or any of this, right? I think part of how we can accept that, if you think about it, is we don't see him committing these acts. Right. Anytime there's a villain on screen where we see the atrocity being committed, no matter what other good things that person does, it stays with us. But if we hear about it and we see them doing good acts, it's more digestible to us. Right. I don't know if you guys have watched Game of Thrones, but I mean, was there ever a more hated character than what's his name? Joffrey or the other one? The
Greyjoy?
No, the one with.
Oh, yes.
Right, not right.
The sausages.
Right. Yes. Right. He was a horrible character. He never had a good moment, but we saw what he did, and there's no getting past that ever. I don't care what that guy did after. There's no getting past that. Whereas, I know we're intelligent enough to know what it would look like without having seen it, but it is. When we see them being good, it's easier to digest, I think, than the visual of seeing them do these horrible things. So I think that's part of it too. But there is that redemptive arc there as well, right? But that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that redemption.
And do you think had we seen what he had done, could we accept him?
I wouldn't have maybe, but I know I would have had way more difficulty with that.
And we're given a taste of that with Junior, where
yes.
in the extended cut, he does what he does and then sacrifices himself to lure the creature in. And, I don't think anyone is sorry to see him go, but there's that moment of, do we actually like him for a moment? I don't know. I was thinking, and again, this is taking in accepted fan lore or the texts that exist outside of the movie. But when this episode was first proposed, I'm thinking, well, obviously Drake and Vasquez are murderers and they were serving time, and that's how they ended up in the Colonial Marines. Everyone knows that. Well, no, not everyone knows that. Even though it's James Cameron's background for those two characters, it's not stated in the movie. And similarly, we know from the dossier that we see behind Ripley in her inquest scene, Kane had a trajectory in a medical field, but had a drug addiction and was kicked out of that, and that's how he ended up in long haul trucking. But again, that's not something that's said out loud in any of the movies. You have to dig a little bit to find that kind of stuff. So almost in blatant opposition to the show don't tell rule, the only reason that we know of what Dillon did is because he fucking says it, and it really works. That's almost the example that proves the rule. Because, boy, I don't want every movie to have someone say something like that, but because he does say it, we have to reconcile it. Everything else he does for the rest of the movie, we're thinking about what he said.
Right.
That's an interesting point to make, that he does say it, because, you know, I've seen, whether it's movies or TVs or shows or whatever, everyone in the prison's always innocent, right? But the road to recovery for a lot of people, whether it's drug addiction or whatever, when you're in recovery, the first thing you have to do is speak it. You have to say, my name is so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic. My name is so-and-so and I'm a whatever. That was what Dillon was doing. I am a murderer and rapist of women. I don't know how many other of those guys could have said that. He fully owned it. And that was to the idea of hearing it and not seeing it. I find it interesting because it's one of those things where you find, you know, people in a neighborhood find out that someone killed somebody else in the house. And like, oh, they were so nice. And it's hard for them to wrap their minds around it because they've never seen him that way. And Dillon is more palatable because we didn't see his crimes, which is an interesting thing, like that we can stomach him more, because we haven't seen his crimes. But I will say that I think that Dillon, like if you look at all the rest of the convicts, Junior, everyone, there's this kind of like uncertainty in their eyes. You look at them and there's almost something missing from them. There's an emptiness to them. You can see it in Morse. You can see it in, everyone. You do not have that same sense with Dillon. You look in Dillon's face, you see a human there. You see humanity there. And I think that's what sets him apart from everyone else. He's the only one saying, what are the guys? How are the guys doing? We got to find out what's going on. He's the only one doing that. He's the only one that seems, moral in objective terms, that he's come around. He realized what I did was a terrible thing. Now, of course, he never says that, but his statement to Ripley, he has owned it. He has owned that I've done some terrible things. And not a lot of prisoners will tell you that. Not a lot of prisoners, even people who are guilty and they know they're guilty, to own the truth, to talk about the truth. The truth hasn't finished with them. And when it's done, maybe they can own it. But until that point happens, they're afraid of it. It scares them. And Dillon has owned his truth. And I think he's really the only one, aside from maybe Clemens, but Clemens is kind of quiet about it. He's clearly embarrassed about his backstory, clearly. But Dillon is the only one, even more than Ripley. Ripley's not even honest with herself or with Clemens about actually what might be going on that colony. Dillon's the only one that's like, this is what's going on. You might be intolerable. I'm a murderer and I'm a rapist. This is what, here I am, all on this table for you. No one else is doing that except for Dillon in this movie. Not even Ripley, which is different for who she is.
And you get the sense that like at one point that was his hair shirt, right? Like that was his penance. And then it became something more than that. It became a part of his self-conception, you know? And that I think really makes an impact on us. I want to also say, you know, Charles S. Dutton got into acting in prison. That was like he, you know, acted in a play for Christmas at the jail that he was serving time in. He got a bunch of other, you know, inmates together and they started putting on theatrical productions, and it turned out he was really great at it. And like, you know, within years he was at, you know, Yale getting his MFA. I think that, you know, when you talk about redemptive arcs, it's important also to look at his life. You know, I mean, he's somebody who has had this beautifully illustrious career. He actually went away from acting for like 20 years because he got into farming. And actually, when we reached out to him, I reached out to his agent probably 4 years ago to come on the show. And the agent was like, he's really just farming right now. Like, that's basically what he's spending his time doing. It's not like he's like a hermit. He's not, avoiding interviews, but he's got a lot of like crops to fix right now. And he's shoveling chicken poop. So like, he's kind of busy. And Charles S. Dutton, basically, he made it as an actor. He had a string of really successful things in the 90s, especially. And then he just like kind of semi-retired, and he's doing some things now. But during that retirement period, he had time for himself to like see this childhood dream out of what it would be like to have a farm. And again, like, I just can't fathom anybody else playing Dillon anywhere near as well as Charles S. Dutton did. And there's some great actors out there who I'm sure could have done a really good job with it. But it feels fated to me. It feels like that was the part that he was born to play. And, in closing, for me, I think it's just another window into all of the crazy improbabilities that Alien 3 presents to us, because we have a broken script with a dejected director. We have a cast that is miserable. We have a set from another movie that never got made being shoehorned into another movie that they didn't even realize what was going on with it. We have a cast, we have a crew that had already been hired for a different project and then left and then had to come back again, and nobody wanted to do it. We had a budget that was long gone. We had 6 different writers working on a script. And yet, at the end of the day, we had a movie that feels like it was designed to happen the way that it happened. And Dillon is a character that is so emblematic of that, more so than anybody else other than Ripley to me. Dillon makes Alien 3 because he is Alien 3, because he is that impossibility. He's like that 1 in a billion actor portrayal who pulls off the impossible, which is like he brings to life something that is completely ineffable.
Amen.
Get the hands up. Yeah.
Well said.
I think, definitely well said. I do feel like as we start talking about, these characters are really tied to each other. And in a way, the Marines are tied to each other. I mean, they are brothers. They're comrades in this life that are living. And I feel like we're going to eventually come back around to Dillon, certainly as we approach who Ripley was in this setting, which I think is fairly volatile, and complex as well. And just the dynamics of what's going on there. So this has been really exciting to me. Again, I was approached this like, okay, yeah, let's talk about Dillon. Like, how much are we going to talk about? But it just got really layered and deep, and it makes me appreciate this movie even more. Like how much detail is in this movie and in the performances, and how much time went in to make this movie the great movie that it is, despite how difficult it is to watch.
Yeah, I have to say, every time I either hear you guys talking about it or I'm engaged in conversation with you about it, you make me appreciate it a little bit more. In this case, definitely a lot more. I mean, I absolutely appreciate it, but you're always coming with a different angle that I either have not seen before and never really thought about. And I love hearing your opinions on it. So I'm looking forward to more.
Well, I love bouncing all of our opinions off each other. And, I come in with a certain bias of how I feel about the film. And when you guys can gently push back and say, but did you look at it this way? Or did you consider this? And so I'm coming out of this conversation, quite honestly, with a new appreciation for the possibility that Dillon is completely what's the word I'm looking for? He's completely repented. He feels that entire part of his history is in the past. And I hadn't thought of that before because of certain things he says in the movie, but I think that his actions make more sense in that context.
Christian, I think the word you were looking for is joyful. I think that's how
I don't want no more bullshit around here.
I think the word I was looking for was crud.
Crud. Before we wrap, I just want to give a couple quick shout outs. One to Magnus Shulquist, Magnus Shulquist. And Magnus, please tell me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. He writes in after a lot of episodes. I always love hearing from you, Magnus. And he wrote in after our commentary saying how glad he was that we allow for different opinions, and that like on Alien 3 in particular, even though it's a movie that's really close to our hearts, we can still pick it apart and have people on with different viewpoints. So that kind of goes to what Christian was just saying. And also a shout out to Ken S., who's a very long time supporter of ours, who just upped his Patreon pledge. Thank you, Ken, for doing that. And if you want to join Ken and everybody else who supports us on Patreon, again, just one more time, you can go to perfectorganism.com/support. I almost ran out of breath when I was saying that. And if you do so, you'll get instant access to a ton of shit, including an upcoming frame rate on the Northman, which I finally saw last night and was freaking great, as well as a recent Sublime Noise that we just put up yesterday on The Fountain, the Darren Aronofsky movie that Clint Mansell scored. We have content going out left and right, including early access to things. So please do sign up if you're on the fence about it. It's just a few dollars a month, and you help us to do, all the stuff that we're working on. So thank you, everybody.
Yes, thanks for listening, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
To find out more information about Perfect Organism, the Alien Saga podcast, please go to www.perfectorganism.com. If you would like to support the show, please go to www.perfectorganism.com/support. Thank you.